Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into an absolutely incredible historical anomaly highlighted in Dr. Elaine Phillips' fascinating lecture on the prophets of the Southern Kingdom. We are going to unpack a text that has survived for millennia, profoundly shaped world history, and presents us with literally one of the most intriguing puzzles in all of ancient literature, the Book of Isaiah.
Okay, let's get right into the heart of the mystery. Chapters 44 and 45 of Isaiah explicitly name King Cyrus of Persia. This is the exact man who historically decreed that the Jewish people could return from their Babylonian exile in 539 BC. But here's the catch, and it's a big one. Isaiah lived and prophesied over a century earlier, primarily during the Assyrian threat. So naming a specific ruler who wouldn't even step onto the world stage for another 50 years, that is a stunning timeline anomaly.
Section 1. The authorship controversy. One author or many.
So this impossible timeline sparks one of the absolute greatest academic debates in biblical history, which we're going to impartially lay out right now. Because depending on how you view the nature of ancient texts, that single mention of King Cyrus completely flips how you interpret the construction of the entire book. On one side, we have the secular academic view. This perspective suggests the text is actually an anthology written by multiple people over centuries. To explain away the Cyrus mention, they propose a Deutero-Isaiah, basically a second Isaiah. This would be an anonymous author writing chapters 40 through 55 during or after the Babylonian exile, when Cyrus was already a famous household name. On the flip side, the traditional view maintains that this is the work of a single author, Isaiah of Jerusalem, who was divinely inspired to accurately predict the future.
In her lecture, Dr. Phillips explains how the traditional view actually pushes back against this multiple author theory using several structural arguments. First off, a single author writing over the span of 40 years is naturally going to change their vocabulary and style as they age, right? Think about something you wrote 20 or 30 years ago compared to how you write today. It's going to be different. But more importantly, consistent themes thread the entire 66-chapter book together. For instance, the very specific title, Holy One of Israel, is used over 25 times across all the different sections. Plus, the temple remains a central unifying theme from the very beginning all the way to the end.
Section 2. The problem with idolatry. A crucial context clue.
Now, you might be wondering, what else points to when this was written? Well, there is a massive clue hiding right in plain sight within these texts, and it has everything to do with the Israelites' historical context. If a later author wrote chapters 40 to 55 after the 70-year Babylonian exile had already completely purged the people of idol worship, why would the text fiercely condemn an obsolete sin? You see, the exile was widely understood as a direct punishment for spiritual adultery, essentially prostituting themselves to other gods. When they finally returned, idolatry really wasn't their main struggle anymore. So a stinging, extensive rebuke of idol worship makes far more historical sense in the 8th century leading up to the exile, rather than after it.
Dr. Phillips points out some absolutely brilliant, biting sarcasm from the author in chapter 44 regarding this exact issue. The text openly mocks blacksmiths working tirelessly over hot coals and carpenters meticulously measuring out wood. The prophet describes a guy going out and cutting down a cedar tree. He uses half the wood as fuel to bake his bread and warm himself by the fire, and then, inexplicably, he carves the leftover scraps of firewood into a figure, bows down to it, and cries out, "Save me, you're my God." I mean, it completely exposes the sheer, unbelievable absurdity of the practice. So the crucial takeaway here is that the author uses the seemingly impossible Cyrus prophecy for a highly specific reason, to prove God can foretell the future. He literally challenges the idols to predict what's to come. By declaring the end from the beginning and explicitly naming Cyrus, the text creates a stark, undeniable contrast between a sovereign, all-knowing God and these blind, deaf, totally powerless objects of wood and metal. Cyrus is essentially the parade example of this divine foresight.
Section 3. A light to Gentiles. A universal message.
You see, the scope of Isaiah's vision wasn't just limited to local geopolitics. He dramatically extended the boundaries of ancient theology to include foreigners and outsiders. He prophesied that the temple wouldn't just be for the Israelites, but that all nations would stream to it. In fact, he gives us the exact quote, "For my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations," that Jesus would later cite directly when cleansing the temple courtyard centuries down the line. It was just an incredibly inclusive vision for its time.
Section 4. Who is the servant? A shifting identity.
This brings us to a fascinating question. Who exactly is the servant in these texts? Well, this identity shifts and evolves in what scholars call the servant songs. Initially, Israel itself is designated as the servant, called to bring justice and light to the nations. But the text quickly pivots, pointing out that Israel has failed. They are a blind and deaf servant. And because of this failure, a specifically appointed person is introduced. This new servant's mission is first to restore the lost tribes of Jacob, and then to expand outward and be a light to the Gentiles, bringing salvation to the very ends of the earth.
All of this culminates in Isaiah 53, which presents the truly shocking imagery of the suffering servant. Rather than some conquering military hero riding in on a horse, the text describes a figure who is despised, rejected, pierced for transgressions, and crushed for iniquities. It's an incredibly powerful concept. The idea is that profound peace and cosmic healing would be achieved not through force, but through the immense substitutionary suffering of this designated servant.
Section 5. The Emmanuel Prophecies, God with Us.
Now, this deeply theological thread regarding a coming figure is actually tied to some very immediate political events. Over in chapter 7, King Ahaz of Judah is utterly terrified. There's a military alliance forming against him between Syria and the northern kingdom of Israel. When God sends Isaiah to tell Ahaz not to worry, Ahaz stubbornly refuses to ask for a sign to confirm it. So Isaiah just prophesies one anyway. He says a child will be born. Using the exquisitely chosen Hebrew word Alma, Dr. Phillips notes this is brilliant because it means both young woman and virgin. It acts as a linguistic bridge. In the short term, it applies to Isaiah's own wife having a son as an immediate sign to King Ahaz, but it also establishes the exact terminology that the New Testament writers would later apply to the Virgin Mary. And the name given to this sign is Emmanuel, which means God with us. This theme threads intricately through chapters 7, 8, and 9. It starts off as a reassurance that God is with Judah against their enemies, but it escalates dramatically. By chapter 9, this prophesied child is being given explicit, undeniable titles of deity: Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. It makes this massive transition from a historical child to a divine messianic king.
Section 6. Micah's Bethlehem Prophecy, The Vital Clues.
Before we wrap up, we absolutely have to talk about Micah. He was a contemporary of Isaiah, prophesying at the exact same time, but out in the foothills closer to the invading armies, rather than safely in the capital of Jerusalem. He actually shared some exact oracles with Isaiah, literally word for word. He's probably best known today for the beautiful, enduring command summarizing what God requires: to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. But crucially for our messianic puzzle here, Micah uniquely pinpointed the exact location where this coming ruler would be born: the small town of Bethlehem. Centuries later, this is the very text the wise men and scholars would cite to King Herod. Well, that leaves us with a staggering thought to close on. Regardless of where you stand on the authorship debate, whether you view this as the brilliant, compiled editing of generations adapting to their exile, or the miraculous, divine foresight of a single ancient prophet, the profound historical and literary impact of these texts is completely undeniable. They have shaped theology, history, and human thought for thousands of years. So I leave you with this. What is it about these specific, ancient words that gives them the power to outlast empires and continue to resonate in the modern world? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning.